Hello, thanks for joining us and welcome to Understory. We're in the war room down under today and joining me is Nick. Hi Nick.
G'day Cam, how you going?
I'm going well. We've got a few good things to talk about today. We're going to look at energy, the energy crisis, the impact on the everyday Australian. We're also going to look at digital identity and we're going to touch on ambulance ramping in the state of South Australia and also in Victoria and New South Wales. So a few good things to look at. Let's start with energy because you're the expert.
Yeah, and I've become so interested in energy over the last few weeks as the oil prices went very high, and this question of why have they gone so very high. And so if I talk too long, you're going to have to cut me off. I don't want to bore everyone because you can get absolutely bogged down in it. I think an interesting thing that happened about a week ago, the International Energy Agency put out 10 points of how you could reduce your fuel usage, how we can reduce fuel usage, and people can see that on the screen. Things like working from home, reducing speed limits on highways. I was surprised by that. I didn't know that would actually reduce your energy consumption, but apparently it would. Car-free Sundays in large cities. Urging people to share cars. I don't know how urging people will necessarily respond in them actually doing that, but maybe the prices alone would drive people to actually start carpooling, preferring trains to planes, things like this. I must admit, in my initial reaction to that 10-point summary, I thought it was quite funny. And I also wasn't clear whether
I actually didn't think it was serious when I read it. I thought it was a...
You thought it was a spoof?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think people were surprised to see that sort of thing coming from the International Energy Agency, but I think it was deadly serious.
Like they could have had dying or something like that, or retiring.
Yeah, that's right. Retiring's always a good option. And of course, some of the things that they pointed out were the reasons why demand was low during the pandemic. Everyone was working from home, but that also had other consequences for the economy. But really, it just highlighted that there is genuinely a big supply problem at the moment. Now, a lot of people have pointed out, well, prices were already going up before the conflict in Ukraine, so has that really contributed? The answer is yes, they were going up before, and yes, it's contributed. Prices were going up for the simple reason, off the back of the pandemic, demand was going up faster than supply could. Even back in November, US started considering dipping into their strategic oil reserves and trying to relieve a bit of pressure on the market. There's just not much excess supply in the world at the moment, and as a result, the prices were going up. Some locations, energy prices have gone up much worse. So we think the oil price has been bad. In Europe, natural gas is more than 5 times the usual price.
Is that right?
And peaked at 8 times the usual price.
So how do people pay for this? I mean, in their everyday life, it's going.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's just the cost of living goes up. It's that simple. And the problem that they have is a significant dependence on Russia, Russian oil, Russian natural gas. And so here's the link between the conflict in Ukraine and the prices. There's 2 links. Firstly, because there's been response to try and sanction Russia, and Russia is one of the 3 main suppliers of oil and one of the 3 main suppliers of natural gas. Anything you do to sanction Russia, a lot of it hasn't been government sanctioning Russia. It's actually been banks and private companies saying we're not going to buy Russian. Anything that does that just makes this supply problem worse.
Well, I've given up vodka. I mean, I've taken my stand.
Right, yeah, no more vodka, no more vodka for me. I must admit, I'm not actually a consumer of many Russian products.
And Russian cigarettes.
So private sanctioning hasn't been an option for me. Yeah, but so that's one connection, of course, sanctioning. But the other thing is, this energy shortage, that's why Putin chose this moment to do it. Because he thought, Europe needs me. The world needs me. They can't afford to resist what I'm doing in Ukraine.
But the impact at a domestic level for Australians at the pump, for example, I noticed that the government is looking to give some relief, some tax relief for their duties, right?
I think that's obviously a good short-term thing that
but they won't control the long-term. That's what you're saying. The long-term supply, they can't control that. They're looking to do some political relief, so to
look,
speak.
that relief is not insignificant because when you pay for fuel at the pump, you're obviously paying GST, that's 10%. You're also paying more than 40 cents of fuel excise that's intended to pay for roadworks and things like that. And so if they can relieve that, that's just
But they can only do that short term. They can only do that short term. In the US, it's $7 a gallon, I'm told, in some places. and it hasn't helped
Yeah.
Biden's popularity. So obviously,
No.
obviously the Morrison government were looking at that and go, well, we don't want to go the same way. But they
Yeah.
can't control the international. That's what's
No.
the international supply thing is beyond their control. And if it's
That's
sustained,
right.
if the problem is sustained, then they won't last forever.
That's right. So really the answer long term is to secure more supply. And it seems that Putin's miscalculated because he thought everyone needs me, so they won't be able to help it. They need me. And really the response of the West has been to say, actually, if you're going to be like this, we can't afford to need you. And so we're going to go through the pain of finding alternate supply, and it is going to be challenging. But there's actually a lot out there if you develop it.
But does this feed into the narrative for alternative energy, clean, green energy?
Well, that's interesting because both sides of that issue have said exactly what you would expect in response. People who are very pro-green said, well, the big lesson from this, we're too dependent on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
We need to swing green. And those who are saying that green is pie in the sky and it's like a long-term vision, but it can't answer today, are saying this is just reminding us of how dependent we are on fossil fuels. And I think I veer towards that side. Look, we've been doing everything we can to get as much renewables into our system as possible, and something like this happens, and immediately becomes very clear we need fossil fuels.
So this is geopolitical, it's ideological, and it's macro-political.
That's right.
For the morals, and it's economic for the everyday person.
Yes.
The everyday person is down the bottom of the food chain from all of those sort of arguments, yeah?
Yeah, and I think if there's something that we should learn from it, there's a number of ways in which we've had some strange ideas about how the world works, and they become revealed when something like this happens. Like the West has thought that you civilise a country by trading with them. If we just trade with them,
went well,
they'll
didn't it?
become more civilised. They'll just use you if they understand there's a codependency. Germany really thought that.
So this is a spotlight on the issue, a longer term issue, which can't be the clean green can't resolve it quickly. And
no, it can't. It can't. I mean, it is really as simple. I know everyone says it, but it is really as simple as when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, you don't have any green energy from sun and wind, and so you can't use them to replace the alternate sources. And what Germany has been doing, in hindsight, is almost irresponsible. The last 2 years, closing down all of their coal-fired and their nuclear power, and as a result, the only thing that was really left that's reliable that they can use is Russian gas.
Well, Biden on day one of his presidency signed an executive order to remove the Keystone project, right?
That's right.
And 20,000 people lost their jobs and so forth, and that appeased the left who were anti-fossil fuels. Now the US is in a bit of we're in a spot, but the US is definitely in it.
The whole world.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone is scrambling for every skerrick of oil that they can get. They're talking to Iran about removing sanctions. They're talking to Venezuela about removing sanctions. They're dipping into strategic oil reserves. They were trying to convince China to dip into theirs. Once the war in Ukraine started, China said, well, actually, no, we're going to increase our oil reserves. And trying desperately to get oil out of Canada, because Canada's problem is they have a lot, but not many ways of getting it out of the country.
Yes.
Their oil is the kind that needs to go down to the Gulf Coast because it's suitable for the refineries there.
Or via a pipeline into the US.
Well, the US Gulf Coast, exactly. So the Keystone XL Pipeline was intended to help relieve that problem.
Yep.
They've been daisy chaining pipelines, reversing their direction, putting it on trains, putting it on trucks, everything they can, desperately to get as much volume.
Did you say trucks?
Yes. Yeah, trucks from Canada, that's correct, crossing the border successfully. Those evil truckers. So really everyone's scrambling to get supply, and I think it really is showing, at a time like this, we talking about, we need to switch to green. When things are this desperate, you don't talk about dancing with the fairies. You need to be talking about real energy. That's what we use, we're plugged into, we absolutely rely on it. There's some interesting lessons coming out of this.
Well, we'll track it. It's obviously... What's your prediction, by the way, before we move on, in terms of the time frame for this to be resolved?
I think everyone is being very, very cautious about doing things in time frames that they can, that are achievable. And so I think we'll have high prices for another year and a half. Because the oil industry takes time to secure new supply. That's
Did you hear that, folks? A year and a half. There's the prediction. There goes Christmas.
Yeah, that's right. We'll have high oil price, but I think they'll do everything they can not to accelerate the conflict in Russia in such a way that Russia actually decides to punish everyone and make it worse, saying you can't have it, turn it off.
Well,
if they turn off gas to Europe, then you have a very immediate big issue.
Yes. If you pick up on those suggestions to save fuel, you can ride a bike to your relatives for Christmas and
you can have
still have the turkey.
That's right, car-free Sundays, because who needs to drive on a Sunday? Alternate private car access to the CBD. So if you have an even numbered number plate, you may only be going into the CBD on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays.
That'll work.
There are a lot of interesting suggestions in that list. It would be an interesting world, but hey, if this supply crisis actually worsens, everyone's trying to make sure it doesn't.
Well,
if it does,
we're certainly in interesting times. And speaking of time, this week you might have noticed Kamala Harris, Vice President of the US, was on a trip to Europe, or had been on a trip to Europe, and spoke after that trip about the passage of time, and it was deeply moving.
Inspirational.
It was inspirational and deeply moving, depending on your position. But let's take a quick look at that.
The governor and I, and we were all doing a tour of the library here, and talking about the significance of the passage of time, right? The significance of the passage of time. So when you think about it, there is great significance to the passage of time in terms of what we need to do to lay these wires, what we need to do to create these jobs. And there is such great significance to the passage of time when we think about a day in the life of our children.
Okay, there's the Vice President of the US. And what was that great saying that you heard the other day?
So Douglas Murray, writing in The Spectator, said that the US currently has a president in cognitive decline and a vice president who was never in cognitive ascent.
Oh, that's so unfair. That's so unfair.
Well, I want to step back and marvel. You can talk about what's the harms, what's the vulnerabilities, but it is amazing that the president of the US is Joe Biden and that the vice president is Kamala Harris. Just two people who display their incompetence and problems so publicly.
Well, while she marvels at the passage of time, his ratings continue to drop over time. So it's not looking good in Washington.
Not for November. November midterms.
No, the
could well
midterms.
be a red wave. I think that's what everyone's betting on at the moment.
And Trump's back into position.
Provided the voting is fair, there's likely to be a red wave, I think.
So into more serious territory now, digital identity. We've been talking in this program about censorship, alternative media and misinformation, those sort of topics, and around that topic, related to that topic is digital identity. So that refers to and relates to your identity online, your digital identity, your personal data for engaging with private sector and public sector services. The question is, the real core question to this, and we'll dig into it a bit now, is who owns your data? So if you're engaging with another party, a third party, do they own the data? Do you own the data? Does a government control and have oversight of that data, because there's a range of government services like welfare or tax or so on. So who owns your data? And where is that data kept and held? How secure is that data? How private is that data? These are the questions that are really troubling people who are looking at what's happening in this digital identity space. And Nick, New Zealand, Australia, the UK are all moving down, and some of the European countries are moving into this with real gusto now, and it's been crafted very interestingly in the background while the pandemic's been going on. They've had time to do this. So the vax passes and the health passes, as they're called in some jurisdictions, have been the precursor to centralised data, and that's the key point. The data is centralised. There's a group in the UK who are really, there's about 40 cybersecurity experts, and they've banded together from a range of countries, not just the UK, and they're challenging what the UK is trying to do, which is to say, you are insisting the security of this data is to be held by third parties whom you designate, government designates, rather than validated by browser, digital certificates and so forth in browsers. So the question is, who are these trusted parties? Why are they trusted? Where's the data? And so on. And so there's a whole debate going on. In Australia now, they've spent up to $600 million to date on this project. There are 4 major agencies coming together to craft our roadmap. And there was a very good article in the Australian Financial Review last week, about a week ago, listing out some of their concerns, and other groups have done similarly. So this is a bureaucratic government move to centralise and coordinate data across a number of agencies and to hold that data in a central location. The point is, it's not their data, it's your data. It's your life being mapped, kept, monitored. And the reason, to me, this is interesting, because if you then link, the misinformation activity that we've been talking about, the $4 million that's been earmarked for that, and I can track your activity hypothetically online, then that becomes another source of data which can be mapped into your profile. So I'm now mapping and monitoring what you do on social media and in the public domain, plus linking that and cross-relating relational database with other activities that you engage in. So there's nowhere to go. I mean, there's nowhere to hide, and that's the whole point here, and that's why people are getting concerned.
Well, so I guess the counter-argument that some people talk about, and I must admit, as an engineer, my initial approach is I like things being efficient. I like things being centralised because, it's all accessible in one place. A couple of examples. So a number of years ago, a cancer researcher giving a presentation spoke about when they were centralising everyone's health data. And there were a lot of people concerned about having it all in one place. But he said, when you have a patient come in, and you're doing research into a cancer that's going to kill them in 3 weeks, you can't afford to go through a bureaucratic process or talk to their doctor or deal with permissions and everything, try and get data you need today. So there is an efficiency bit, but what are the dangers? What are the dangers then that we need to be managing when it comes to handling people's data?
Well, last year, the Australian Defence Force, ADF, was actually hit with a cybersecurity event, and for 10 days their whole systems were down. This is the ADF. I don't know who launched the assault, one can guess, but that happened. So the question would be, well, if the ADF aren't secure, why would I think my data is going to be secure with you? I mean, I get the point in terms of there are some efficiencies and there's some relevancy with where we're going. I mean, we're not going to roll back this digital thing. I mean, we live in a digital era, digital age, so I get it. So we can't be naive about it. But there are just so many unknowns. It's too opaque, it's too ill-defined, and the actors within those groups, who will actually take charge of this, and even for the government, it's now moved within the Prime Minister's domain, but there's still criticisms about how unwieldy and how uncertain they are about what they're actually trying to achieve.
Yeah. So, because I think that from my part, there's 2 concerns I have. One is just the government's ability to execute it well.
Yes.
Because I think there's not a good track record with the government executing digital things. You can think about a digital census that didn't necessarily work very well, and the number of other digital platforms they've tried to launch. If you ever watch the show Utopia, they're constantly bagging the government's ability to do anything on digital platforms. And of course, associated with that is the security bit, their ability not just to execute and implement it, but do it in a way that's secure from other countries.
Well, the program's called the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, TDIF.
Just because you say it's trusted doesn't automatically make it trusted.
No? Oh, well, it had me fooled. So we'll keep tracking the Trusted Digital Identity Framework and see what happens. It's a really huge topic, and it impacts in a number of areas. You can't just...
It touches one other thing that I think we're likely to revisit a number of times, which is also the government is inherently the most dangerous party in town, if you know what I mean. The government, you can talk about different corporations having too much power. The government employs more than 10% of the workforce. The government has the power of force, the ability to take things from you, the ability to arrest you. And so government is inherently dangerous. And so when we set up governments, and the Western democracies were designed this way, it's to contain that power, to apply checks and balances. And if you want to see what that can look like when it's unconstrained, when the government takes too much power, power to censor, power to know everything about you, then you can just look at China, for instance, with their social credit system. And so allowing the government to give itself more and more power of that kind. It's not that having a digital identity or having identity systems in itself is bad, but there are vulnerabilities that have to be managed, and maybe it shouldn't be the government sitting
Well,
at the
they
heart
argue,
of that.
the argument for this is fraud, terrorism, misinformation, efficiencies, like you say. So they're all legitimate conversations.
There are other threats, but they never argue about themselves as a threat.
No, that's right.
And yet unconstrained government is
Yeah.
the biggest threat. If you look in history, who's killed more people than any other organisation?
Well, the
the government.
Electronic Frontier Foundation in the UK is really concerned about it, and there are people here concerned about it. Some senators going into the House in Canberra who are arguing the case. So this is not over, and it won't be a fast solution either. It's already taken a number of years to get to this point, and the 4 agencies collaborating and so on. But we are entering a new era in this country if government remains unchecked, and if you lose control of your data.
Yeah, it's efficiency at what cost?
Yes, correct. Okay. Well, we'll track it. The other thing we've been tracking is the ambulance ramping in South Australia, and also what's going on in Victoria and New South Wales, Albury-Wodonga, for example. Albury-Wodonga has reported, recently has reported 200 cases presenting per day at their hospitals, 200 cases per day, a significant increase, and that means a stretch on resources, not just ambulances, but the hospital resources. So we're seeing in Western countries an increase, an uptick in certain conditions, which means that medical services are going to be stretched, and they were stretched theoretically through the so-called pandemic. So why were those services not upgraded? ICU, for example, and ambulance services, why were they not upgraded in the last 2 years? If we were indeed in a pandemic, if we were indeed all about to die or at least be rushed to hospital, why were those services not increased?
Yeah, and all that emphasis in the policies on preventing the health services from being overburdened, but not a whole lot on actually increasing the health services capacity.
Well, let's take a look at this clip from April of last year with Premier Daniel Andrews in Victoria talking about increasing their ICU capacity by a significant amount, in fact the highest or largest ICU facility in the Southern Hemisphere. Take a look at this.
Melbourne Convention Centre. I don't rule out the exhibition buildings, whatever it might be, a really big space. And I've been asked this a few times. I'm not confirming that today, but I certainly don't rule out building something that is a standalone conversion of a big space into what would be one of the biggest intensive care units in our country, perhaps anywhere in the world.
So about a year and a half later, that ICU facility doesn't exist. There were no more doctors and nurses. In fact, they let frontline staff go, terminated. So it was the actual reverse of what they were proposing, and the facility wasn't built. So these promises are made, and then one of the promises made in the lead up to the South Australian election was made by the Labor Party, which said Labor will fix ambulance ramping. Ramping is queuing at the hospitals, if you're not familiar with the term. So that was a placard. The now Premier said he would do it, and then just a few days prior to the election, said it would be irresponsible to claim they could do it. The ambulance union and frontline workers were making a lot of noise about the facilities in South Australia, the capacities in South Australia, and they have now just come out and relaxed that position post-election. Interesting. And the new Premier has said that they will fix ramping, but it won't take days, it won't take weeks, months, it may take years. So yes, he's holding true to the promise, but you just have to be patient. So,
yeah, and this is one thing that's, I guess, difficult for everyday people, because we don't all work for SA Health, we don't all work in the hospitals and see what actually, we have to trust what we're told. And when something is so clearly politicised, being used as a political bludgeon to try and say we support this party in the election, not that party, and ambulance ramping is the argument we're going to use, then you don't really know what to believe. But certainly with people I've spoken to in SA Health and about SA Health, it is a mess in South Australia. It's a mess. The execution of the project of building an enormous new hospital, it looks beautiful, way over budget, a lot of problems with executing it. I've certainly waited for a very long time in that hospital to be assisted, and when I had to go into the emergency ward a couple of years back. So definitely SA Health is not in a good way, and I think that clearly it's something that could do with a bit of priority, but it needs the sort of priority that looks realistically at how we spend money, what the incentive schemes are, but also all the organisations that exist within SA Health at the moment. Why aren't they working? And I think that it's just a bureaucratic nightmare.
But the Liberal government, if they were communicating that we were in a pandemic and things were dire, borders were closed and so forth, then they had the very opportunity to upgrade that and to actually get political kudos from that.
They had a pretext.
They had a pretext
to actually fix things.
and they had a reason.
Yeah.
If you believe the narrative, but they didn't do it. So they were sitting ducks for a political campaign. They got that political campaign, and they lost the election. So
they had a pretext, perhaps more than some people realise. So the ICAC, the Corruption Commission, actually, of their own volition, sent a letter to the Parliament saying SA Health needs to be investigated.
Yes.
It's a mess, and in response to the pandemic, instead of using it as a pretext to fix it, they used it as essentially a reason not to. They had, oh no, we have to have confidence in our health system at the moment. We can't be undermining it.
Yes.
And so nothing changed.
So the outcome of the election in South Australia was that Labor was elected significantly with about 7 or 8% swing. And now the new Premier is saying he will fix it, so he's out there with a promise which he can hold his hand on heart and say he's going to keep. It will just take years.
Just a few years.
So if we are still in a pandemic, which the Emergency Act in South Australia would suggest, then why not fix it now? But they're not going to do that.
No, I must admit, it's probably a really big task. It's a mess. It's a mess, a big bureaucratic nightmare going on over there.
Speaking of big tasks, the South Pacific. That's a big area, a big expanse, and there's a lot going on there. We're going to dig into that next program, because there is a lot of concern about what's going on in the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea with the incursions from China, the investments of monies into projects, ports and so on. And there were numerous warnings and alerts to the Australian government over the last 12, 18, 24 months, and indeed before that, which for whatever reason have not been taken to heart. And now there's real alarm, especially with New Guinea moving even more closely aligned with China.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a growing and interesting problem. Of course, China throughout the world has been putting its fingers in as many pies as it can. Small islands in the Pacific are easy to influence very rapidly because populations are so low. But even in Australia, the amount of our own infrastructure and resources that are owned by China, it's not an easy problem. It is an interesting and very important one.
So we'll take a bit of a cross-section of the island nations of the Pacific next program, and bring some information on that, because it's something we really do need to be aware of as Australians, because this is a region of real significance, geopolitical significance, and the moves by China into that area need to be considered, and we need to formulate a response to that over time, otherwise we'll be caught. Thanks for joining us.